Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us again today. It's been a pleasure. I think you're going to like today's episode and the next one after this. Hello, Lou.
How are we doing this morning?
Good, good. We were just talking about how the weather has gotten so much better.
Yeah, first good day in a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so today we're doing chapter 13. We're going to do verse 19 and 20. And I think, friends, we've gotten into a part of the Gita that is very different from what people think the Gita is all about. We were just talking to some people yesterday about the Gita, friends of ours for many, many, many years, and they thought the Gita is all about religious practices and prayers and rituals and going to temples and stuff like that. And you've seen now, as we've gone through many different episodes, that that's the furthest, couldn't be further from the truth. So basically, this is very, very scientific. And these next few episodes you will see are like at the heart of this scientific explanation of what God or religion, God per se, is all about. Now, bear with me because we're now at a point in the Gita where the Gita explains to us what life is all about. What life is all about. I mean, all along we said, animals have life, birds have life, human beings have life, but what is that life? And now, in the earlier part of the Gita, we saw that life is basically God. It's an energy. It's not a he, it's not a she. It's energy that comes within us, inside us. And you've seen that there are basically three parts to the Gita: part one, part two, part three, which is the first out of 18 chapters. The first six chapters are talking about you as an entity, and the second six chapters are talking about that which is God or Atman or the force that we call life. And the next six chapters, which starts now, is basically talking about the relationship between God and between life and you, between life or spirit and matter, which is your body. So that's where we're at. So verse 19 says, thus the kshetra or field, as we called it, as well as knowledge or jnana, and that which has to be known has been briefly stated in these previous verses. That's what Krishna says.
Yeah.
And Krishna says, knowing this, my devotee, meaning somebody who's devoted to the Atman, to Brahman, to the self, knowing this, my devotee attains my being. So he's saying here, and this is just basically a conclusion to the last so many verses of the 13th chapter, and he's opening up the door to the next few verses. So if you remember, the kshetra, the body, the matter that we constitutes us, we talked about up to verse 7. 6 and 7 particularly, we talked about kshetra, the body. And then 8 to 12, we did the 20 qualities of knowledge, that humility and unpretentiousness and all of that. From 8 to 12, we talked about knowledge, how to get that knowledge. And the next, from 13 to 18, we talked about jnaya, which is that which has to be known, which is Atman. So we did all that. And he's saying that I spoke about that very briefly. And for us, it might have been intensive or heavy, but he's saying it's brief. He says, but if you know this, then you will attain God. So that's like saying through intense meditation, thinking only about Brahman, Brahman, Brahman all the time, as if you're sitting in the Himalayas, you can become self-realized. You can do that right here on this earth if you just give up all of your hankerings and desires for everything else and become self-realized. But the analogy is of a river flowing towards the ocean and then wanting to merge with the ocean. Now, when the river merges with the ocean, you no longer can tell what is the difference between the river and the ocean, except right at the delta, where the river first merges. There's a whole big muddy area. That's the delta.
Right.
And after that, it becomes one. Then you can't tell which was the river water, which was the ocean water. It's all one. So same thing happened with somebody who becomes self-realized. They rush towards Brahman, and then they become Brahman. So it's like dream. You can't become partially self-realized. You can't become partially awake and partially dreaming. When, for example, if you're dreaming, you're suffering in the dream, you think, I'm poor, I'm diseased, and the only way to get rid of that suffering is to wake up.
Right.
When do you wake up? When the dreamer is completely dissolved. That's the only time you wake up. So even as long as even a little bit of the dream is still present, you are not rid of the dream. You are
Right.
still dreaming. What he's saying is, my devotee attains my being when he's completely immersed in me. So that's where we are at the end of 19. Now starts a very important piece of information for you, which is verse 20. And hopefully you will join us for the next episode where we're talking about verse 21. So in verse 20 says, know that Prakriti. Now, we've talked about Prakriti before. It comes up again, the word, and Prakriti means matter, and Purusha means spirit. The spirit that lives within the matter, or the life, God, Atman, soul, spirit, that's living within the matter, which is known as Prakriti. The verse goes, know that Prakriti and Purusha are both without a beginning. So no beginning, no end.
Mm-hmm.
Know that they are without a beginning, and also know that the modifications and gunas or qualities are born of Prakriti, not Purusha. Might be confusing, so just put that in your mind and let's address each one of these separately. So first we're going to talk about Prakriti, then we're going to talk about Purusha, then we're going to talk about what does it mean without a beginning, and then we're going to talk about what does modifications and gunas are born of Prakriti mean. You with me, Lou?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating.
So, as I said before, the first six chapters of the Gita are talking about Tvam, which is you. The second six chapters are talking about God, that, tat. And the last six chapters are talking about Asi, which is the relationship between God or life or Atman or the self and you. So now we're at that point. This is now that point. Prakriti really is matter, all matter. A stone is Prakriti. My body is Prakriti. Right now, it is a combination of my body and life because I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking, I'm feeling, I have emotions. It's a combination of spirit or God and matter. But if the spirit were to leave me and the body were inert without any life and I were to drop down dead, then it's pure Prakriti, just matter. I hope that's clear.
Yes.
So, Prakriti is matter and it constitutes the entire terrestrial world. Not just the world, but also the entire universe. Mars is part of Prakriti. Moon is part of Prakriti. All of these planets, stars, space is all part of Prakriti. What does Prakriti means? In Sanskrit, the breakdown of Prakriti is Pratham Kriti. Pratham means first, Kriti is born. So Pratham Kriti means firstborn. Now, Pratham Kriti, firstborn, Prakriti is the firstborn of what? Fourthborn. So we'll come to that. Prakriti also is known as Kshetra, which is the field, which we talked about in verses 5, 6, 7. And it is unmanifest. Let me address what does unmanifest mean. If you remember, in verse 6, we talked about 24 elements of the body. And we also talked about 31 elements of the body. And 24 elements, remember we talked about different parts, the mind, the intellect, the ego, ahankar. We talked about the 5 sense organs, the 5 organs of action. There's 24 of them. But one of them we said was known as avyakta, which was the unmanifest. You remember that?
Yeah.
Avyakta, non-manifest, the seed. Now, this is very, very interesting. This seed forms you. This avyakta forms the entire other 24 tattvas and the 31 tattvas. So it's unmanifest. So imagine if you have a oak tree, right? The oak tree has a seed. And when you look at the seed, I've never seen an oak tree seed, so I don't know how big it is or small it is. But let's say that Ramatirtha talked about the seeds of a mustard plant.
Yeah.
They're tiny, tiny. So I don't know that there's any seed smaller than a mustard seed. There may be. But Ramatirtha talks about this mustard seed. And he says, science can do anything and everything. What it cannot do is recreate life. So even the tiniest of seeds, like a mustard seed, if you put it in the right soil and you allow sunlight to go on it and water and the natural climates, it grows into a plant. So where does that life come from, he says, Ramatirtha says. And often you must have thought about it, I've thought about it, where does this life come from? So imagine that oak tree seed has in it all of the components of this huge big oak tree that's going to develop into into roots and trunk and branches and leaves and all kinds of acorns, all of this. A banyan tree, if you ever go to India, you'll see huge banyan trees that are like, I don't know, 50, 60 more years old, 300 years old. Huge banyan trees. The redwood forest, if you've been to California, huge, huge trees. And yet the seed is so small, but it contains in it everything. Put that aside. Just look at the human being. If you look at the seed of a human being, combination of a sperm and an ovum, when you were to first look at it, you would never recognize that it has the spleen, the liver, the heart, the eyes, the fingers, the fingerprints. Everything is included in that seed. The DNA from thousands of generations, it's all in there, in that small little ovum and the small little sperm. So that seed is the unmanifest seed. It hasn't yet manifested into a person. When it manifests, the manifestation takes place. That's the Prakriti. That is the firstborn, before the mind comes, before the intellect, before the five sense organs, before all of that. It's the first. So it is the firstborn. That's why it's called Prakriti, the firstborn. Now, Prakriti manifests as the kshetra. The seed manifests as the entity. We manifest as the body, as the mind, intellect. Now, Prakriti or matter has three qualities. Now, the entire 14th chapter, we're going to be talking about these three qualities. Very, very important, because when Prakriti manifests as something, anything, not just a human body. When I say Prakriti, a tree is Prakriti, the wind is Prakriti, a stone is Prakriti, an animal is Prakriti. Prakriti, or anything that comes manifests as Prakriti manifests itself as, has three gunas, which is Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. We've talked about this at length, and we will be talking about it at length. But Sattva is a quality of equanimity, equilibrium. Everything is peaceful, calm, laser sharp. Rajas is all activity, agitation, wanting to do. And Tamas is just pure laziness and indolence. Now, all three qualities are present in any manifestation of Prakriti. So you will see, and we will go into this to see how these manifestations, we won't go into that now. But Prakriti is also consisting of time, space, and causation. So now we're getting into a very scientific area, which I will discuss more fully because when we get to the beginning that we said. But because of that, Prakriti appears eternal, all-pervading, infinite, with no beginning and no end. But it has qualities such as the gunas. So that we talked about Prakriti. He says, know that Prakriti and Purusha are both without a beginning. So now we talked about Prakriti, now we're going to talk about Purusha. Purusha is spirit, consciousness, life, Brahman, God, reality, the self. It resides in the Prakriti, okay? It resides in the Prakriti. It also resides everywhere else around us. But when it attaches to Prakriti, that's when you become an individual, a human being. So keep this in mind. Electricity is everywhere, maybe, right? Imagine you're in, but when that electricity comes through a wire into a light bulb, the light bulb goes off.
Right.
That, if you say, where does that electricity in that light bulb come from? It comes from a massive source of electricity through the wires, and then the light bulb lights up. When the electricity and the, what is it called, filament inside the bulb light up, you see light. Similarly, that electricity has been residing in that light bulb. This Brahman, this life force, is all pervading. It's everywhere, going out unto the space forever. infinity. When that comes into this body, this Prakriti, then I start to cry. As I come out of the mother's womb, get a slap on the back, I start to cry. This individual has started to have life with the body and the mind. So far, so clear, I hope?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Lou.
Pretty deep, though. But yeah, it's clear.
It's going to get deeper. Wait and see. It's fascinating. I found it fascinating. So imagine that out in space, you, as we said, you have all these planets. The moon, for instance, is a planet. Sun is shining, light being given everywhere. Yet you don't see that light. You know that light, by the way, I hope you all know that light, when it travels through a vacuum, you don't see any light.
Right.
Only if you take that vacuum, if you have a tube or vacuum and you sprinkle dust into it, wherever the light hits that dust, you will see shining particles of dust. But the rest of it, where there's a vacuum, you don't see any light.
Right.
Similarly, when the sun is shining on the moon, the minute that light hits the moon, you see the moon shining. Okay? When the sun is traveling from the sun to the moon, you don't see a ray of light coming there, do you? You just see the moon. You don't see, we all know when we look up at the moon, we look up at the sky, we say, look at the moon, it's shining. We say, does the moon have light inside it? No, it doesn't. It's just a reflecting surface reflecting the light from the moon. So you say, well, where's the light coming from? How come I don't see this column of light going from the moon all the way up to the sun? Because it's not visible. It only becomes visible when it hits something. Just like electricity, you don't see it in the wire that's coming. Only when it hits the filament, you see it. This is important for you to know. That light, that sunlight, if it had an emotion or feeling, imagine that it's coming from the sun and then touches the moon, and suddenly it says, wow, look how much brightness I'm producing. Look at me, I'm so great. Now this is life, Purusha, speaking. Yep. Imagine it speaking. It doesn't speak, but imagine it speaking and says, whoa, I am so good. I'm the brightest thing around here. There's nothing as bright as me. Look at me. Me and moon together, we're shining like so brightly. And look at me and my cousins and brothers, parts of light that were coming from the sun. They don't shine like me. Only I shine because I'm lighting on the moon. Similarly, if you took ink in a pen and you were to put it down on paper, right, and you're writing a nice poem that is a tearjerker, and you're crying and you're happy and you're laughing, and as you pick up the paper and you start to read, you say, wow, what a beautiful poem. It's full of pathos and comedy, and I'm laughing and I'm crying at the same time. And the ink says, yeah, it's me. It's me. I'm the one that put it down on paper. Imagine that ink is Purusha, alighting with the Prakriti of the body and saying, it's me. So that's what we're going to be talking about right now, that the Purusha then starts to enjoy pleasure and pain when it's a combination with the Prakriti. So I'm ahead of myself. So the Prakriti has those qualities, the three gunas, and Purusha fuses with the Prakriti like sunlight on a moon, right? Yep. Now, the reason it's called Purusha is because it lives in Puru. Now, Pur means, like cities in India are called Nagpur, Sholapur, different Purs, which mean a city.
Right.
And even in Great Britain, you see it ends in like por, P-O-R. And those are all Sanskrit words for cities. So Purusha is one who resides in the Puru. So Prakriti and Purusha together form everything in life that is living. Purusha has no beginning, no end, no form, no pervasiveness, no pervading. It's infinite. There's no qualities because it has no gunas. So if you say, when did life first start? Where did Brahman first come from? You don't know. We don't know. We don't know when Brahman first came from. Right. So just like the light of a sun falls on the moon, ink in a printer, electricity in a Tesla, right? We use this example many times because I used to have a Tesla, and the Tesla, worked very well with electricity. Doesn't work without electricity. Or a dream. You fall asleep and the dream starts. Without the dreamer, there is no dream. You may say, well, where did the dreamer come from when you're in the dream? And in the dream, you don't know where that dreamer came from. It's only when you awake and you know it. So we've touched about Prakriti, we talked about Purusha. Now, the next thing is, in that verse, he says, it is without a beginning. What does that mean? Without a beginning. What is beginning and end? It's really referring to time, correct?
Yeah.
Time. This is the beginning of that time. This is the end of that time. In order for you to determine time or beginning, you have to have an experience. This might be a little complicated, but if you understand it, it's brilliant. There has to be a first experience and then a second experience in order to have a period of time. Right? You go from point A to point 2, from point 1 to point 2, and then you say, I had an experience. That is time. And that's why, by the way, the second experience is when that time took place. From this point to this point, there has to be a second point, and so that's why it's called the second. That's why we measure time in seconds.
Interesting.
Yeah. So second. So there has to be a first experience and a second experience. So if you look at Purusha, the spirit, Brahman, we say it's always been there. It's infinite. Space, you say, okay, space, it's there in the galaxy. Space started in the galaxy. Well, what about beyond the galaxy? Well, there has to be space there too, because we don't know that there's a boundary around the universe anywhere. So we say space is infinite. Same thing with time. It's infinite because we don't know when time started. We don't know when it'll end. Same thing with Brahman. We don't know when Brahman was there. But the first experience, Brahman alone cannot have an experience. We cannot have an experience with Brahman because Brahman is just energy. In order to have an experience, you have to have Prakriti, some matter, something to happen. So if Brahman is not there, if Prakriti goes back forever, then you cannot have a second if you don't have a first. So there is no beginning. That's what he's saying. Same for distance. You can't have a second point to go to if you don't have a first point. So there's no beginning, no end. Now comes the last portion, which is, it says you are attached to matter. We are all born of Prakriti. So you, as Purusha, are attached to Prakriti, right? Now, what part of Prakriti is the life attached to? Excuse me. When you have a seed, a human being in that seed, a combination of sperm and ovum, there's life inside it. By the way, people often say in the scriptures, in the Hindu scriptures, it is written that the body is formed in the mother's womb, but life does not enter it at the point that the sperm and ovum join together. It's a key, very important. Then you say, okay, then does it join at the point that the baby is coming out of the mother's womb? And the scriptures say that it actually, you can't tell. It depends on the fetus. That sometimes it is there right in the beginning, and sometimes some period throughout that 9 months, and sometimes just before birth. But once it's born, at the point that it cries, it has life. It has life it has life from the time its heart is beating, in that sense. But Purusha has not entered it.
Right.
There's a difference. So, just like you have a mechanical heart beating, or the breathing is taking place, or the skin is growing or shedding in the womb, but there may not necessarily be Purusha in that. So it's a very deep and important thing for you to keep in mind. And how does that work? It works by the fact that when we have good karma, we have the choice of where we want to be born. And I don't know how that choice is made or given to us, but it's given to those who have done good karma for you to decide which womb, which family, which mother, which father, which environment you are going to be born in. And that you have that choice to make. So sometimes those choices are left for some later point during those 9 months. And the fetus is growing inside the mother. But life Purusha actually enters into it at some point during those 9 months. So well, that's way far from what we're talking about. But where exactly does that Purusha end? Where enter and where does it fuse? So life goes into that body and attaches where? To the nose, to the ear, to the heart. People will say, oh, it attaches to the heart, it
Yeah.
attaches to the brain. If it was attached to some part of the body, the gross body, then when the body drops, the life would drop too, right? We would then become, okay, fine, I'm immortal now because the body died, I died too.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, the Purusha, the life force, attaches to that seed, the unmanifest avyakta. It attaches there.
Hmm.
And so when the body drops, the body is dead. We don't feel anything, we don't see anything, the body's dropped. But that unmanifest avyakta has the seed, the firstborn, is still there, and attached to it is the life force, the spirit. And together with that and every other facets of those 24, the mind, the intellect, the vasanas, the desires, the ahankar, the ego, all of that is now looking for a new body. And that's when it says, okay, depending on what karmas I've done, good or bad, I can choose this womb or that mother or that family. And you have a choice because you've done such good karma. You have a choice of 1,000,000 wombs to be born to.
Yeah.
So that attachment of that life force is to the avyakta, the unmanifest. So that has that attachment, not attached to the body. You're attached to matter, not Purusha. So modifications and gunas are born of Prakriti. What does that mean? It means that when there is, as an example, electricity, if it goes into a fan, the fan starts moving, right? You may say, well, that's this electricity that's moving. No, it isn't. It's the fan that's moving. And the qualities and modifications of that electricity are shown in things that are exact opposite. So, heater, when electricity goes into an electric heater, heat comes out. And you say, oh, this is wonderful. That's the quality, that's the guna of that heater. The heater guna is the heat that comes out of it. But the same electricity in the summer goes through a cooler, air conditioner,
Right.
and cool air comes out of it. That the guna of that air conditioner is the cold air that comes out of it. The modifications, therefore, are not from the electricity. They are from the modifications of the matter, which is either a heater or an air conditioner. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Same
So,
electricity, different outcome.
right. So we are a combination of life, spirit, energy, God, and matter. And depending on our matter, our manifestations are different. So our gunas are different. I look different, Lou looks different, she looks different, he looks different. And our functioning is different. Our gunas, we may be very spiritual, we may be very active and rajasic, and we may be very lazy and tamasic. Those are our gunas. Same thing, if you come out as a food, you could be the material, prakriti food, can be very spicy food, which is very rajasic food. Or
Yeah.
it could be dull and heavy with fat and laden with fat. That's considered tamasic food. And there's classifications of everything, which we'll see in chapter 14. So the world itself has four qualities. The world is number one, time, space, and causation, as we said before. In deep sleep, there's no time, no causation, no space. Because when you wake up, even after if you're in a coma and you wake up, you don't know how long you've been asleep. When you're in deep sleep and you suddenly somebody wakes you up, you say, how long have I been asleep? You don't know.
Right.
There's no cause and effect. We're going to be talking about cause and effect in the next episode. The second is world itself, second quality, has gunas. There's rajasic guna, sattvic guna, tamasic guna. The third quality is that there's moving and unmoving. And that's the living is movement, and non-moving is inert objects like stones. And the last is dwandwas, which is opposites. You remember we talked about dwandwas in the beginning of the Gita. Dwandwas mean opposite. So you like one quality, guna, you dislike the other. For instance, cold and heat, wealth and poverty, honor, dishonor. You like one, you don't like the other. If you like wealth, you're not going to like poverty. You like cold, you don't like the heat. If somebody likes heat, he doesn't like the cold. And you move about your dvandvas from one to the next. And the last thing that we should know about is as you grow spiritually, to that extent, you're not affected by these dvandvas or by the world. So if you're 20% spiritual, to that 20%, you're not going to be affected. If you're 0% spiritual, everything affects you 100%. If you're 50% spiritual, to that 50%, you're not affected by what's going on. When there's heat and you like cold, you say 50% of part of you says, I'm less affected by half than I used to be before I was 50% affected. So, long discussion over verse 19.
Yeah.
You will see when we come to and verse 20. When you come to verse 21 in the next episode, you'll see even more. So, any comments, Lou?
That was just deep. I'm going to have to go through this episode a couple times there, but it opens the door on a fascinating aspect of this, which I'm sure we're going to dive into a lot more as we go forward.
Yes. Thank you so much, friends, for joining us. And Lou, thank you for all your help. And we'll see you in the next episode.